This is Lesson 20.1, the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Specifically, why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Britain and how did it develop between 1780 and 1850? College Board Topic 6.1, Contextualizing the Industrial Revolution and its origins and effects. Explain the context in which industrialization originated, developed, and spread in Europe. And we've got this. Great Britain established its industrial dominance through the mechanization of textile production, iron and steel production, and the new transportation systems in conjunction with a uniquely favorable political and social climates. All of that is important and meaningful. And we've got College Board Topic 6.2, the spread of industry throughout Europe. In other words, leaving Britain now. Explain the factors that influenced the development of industrialization in Europe from 1815 to 1914. Britain's ready supplies of coal, iron ore, and other essential raw materials promoted industrial growth. Economic institutions and human capital, such as engineers, inventors, and capitalists, helped Britain lead the process of industrialization largely through private initiative. And Britain's parliamentary government promoted commercial and industrial interests because those interests were represented in Parliament. So here's our place: Britain, England, Wales, and Scotland between 1780 and 1850, maybe 1851. Key concepts of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. We've got the spinning jenny, the water frame, the spindle, the steam engine, and to top it all off, the Crystal Palace. Key people: Richard Arkwright, George Stephenson, James Hargreaves, James Watt, and Henry Court. So let's begin with patterns to look for in the Industrial Revolution. Number one, it was unplanned. There was no national strategy to industrialize. There were no previous models of industrialization to copy. When you look back at the new republics of the Renaissance, in Renaissance Italy, they had classical Rome to copy, and Greece. But the Industrial Revolution was uncharted territory, and there was no way to predict its ramifications to the economy, and there was no way to predict its ramifications to society. It had literally never happened before. Also, there was this continuous cycle of have a problem, solve the problem, run into another problem. Solve that problem, run into another problem. And then solve that problem, run into another problem, etc. So there was no overall end game to the Industrial Revolution. Also, the Industrial Revolution involved thousands and thousands of innovators rather than just the few that we study. We're studying just the tip of the iceberg. And there were many more tinkerers than there were actually formally trained engineers in the Industrial Revolution. Many of the most successful and influential innovators are not named in our textbook. And all of the people named in our textbook had massive amounts of technical support and financial support, in other words, capital, from those people whose names we'll never know. Third thing, the Industrial Revolution didn't happen overnight. It wasn't instantaneous. It actually happened over a period of generations. At its peak, the rate of industrial growth was only about 3% per year, and household income increased much more slowly than that. But that certainly beats the 0.7% industrial growth that was happening before 1760. Also, the Industrial Revolution was not an across-the-board process. It really only began in just a few key industries, and those are textiles, iron, and transportation. These were key industries, and changes in these industries profoundly affected other industries, and changes in these industries profoundly affected each other. Another thing, the Industrial Revolution was also about energy, not just machines. In other words, there were two halves to the industrial equation. Before the Industrial Revolution, human industry was seriously underpowered. You had human and animal muscle. You had water and wind power. You had basic heat fuels, mostly wood, some coal. And after the Industrial Revolution, human industry had almost unlimited power. First, steam power, and then later, combustible fuels, electricity, and chemicals. Fourth, the Industrial Revolution was a unique historical development. For the first time ever in the history of mankind, you had number one, dynamic and sustained economic growth, and number two, dynamic and sustained population growth. And these two growth areas are interacting with each other, and these two areas of growth are still happening right up to this very day. A seventh thing, and this is very important, there emerged new patterns of haves and have-nots in society, not only within European society, but also between Europe and the rest of the world. Before the Industrial Revolution, the large trading countries of the world were roughly equal in per capita production, economic power, particularly China and India. But after the Industrial Revolution, Europe, along with the US and Japan, jumped way out in front of the rest of the world. And it was going to create us and you tensions around the world that are still very much with us today. Let's say that you were writing an essay on this question. You can divide Britain's unique advantages over other countries into three main areas. Number one, commerce. Number two, colonies. And number three, sea power. These three advantages are interrelated, and you can further explain Britain's commercial and colonial preeminence in these three terms: capital, markets, and raw materials. Britain had a unique combination of 9 factors that we can identify, and we're going to go into each one of these in more detail right now. But let's just take inventory of them right here. Number one, Britain had high wages for labor. Number two, Britain had a culture of innovation. Number three, Britain had the agricultural revolution and cottage industry. Number four, Britain had the right geography. Number five, Britain had a relatively peaceful and centralized government. Number six, Britain had lots and lots of coal. Number seven, Britain had an advanced banking system. Number eight, Britain had skilled artisans. And lastly, number 9, Britain had a vast trading empire. Britain was ready for an economy that would be A, capital investment based, and B, powered by machines rather than humans. So let's explore each of these 9 factors individually. Number 1, Britain had high wages. If you have a country with a population of millions of people who are willing to work for low wages, like China and India had, then you really don't need to innovate in order to manufacture goods competitively. Inventing a machine that will do the work of thousands of cheap humans makes no sense for you. Designing such a machine, getting skilled mechanics, securing the investment, building it, working out the snags, improving it, marketing it, servicing it, testing it, overcoming resistance to it, these are all unnecessary endeavors for you if you're in that kind of a country. All of these things will actually cost you much more than just paying thousands of cheap humans to do it the traditional way. But if you have a workforce of humans that is smaller, more educated, more skilled, and more heavily taxed, then you can't compete with those other countries that pay their workers a fraction of what you have to pay yours. And there's only one way to solve that dilemma. You have to figure out how to get more production out of a smaller, more expensive workforce. You need machines that can leverage the power and speed of your humans. Number 2, we said that Britain had a culture that encouraged innovation. Britain had seen the value of these 3 previous developments: the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the agricultural revolution. And you had a culture that believed that useful knowledge should be celebrated and shared. And all kinds of technical manuals were popular and plentiful in Britain. Societies often hosted competitions for innovations with cash prizes. Number 3, we said that Britain already had the agricultural revolution and cottage industry before 1760. The agricultural revolution had created more food with fewer farmers, as we saw. More labor had become available for cottage industry. Cottage industry had been very successful in Britain, big part of the economy, and Britain was exporting woolen cloth made from cottage industry all over the world. These produced higher wages. More people were making more money to buy more manufactured goods, and people could also pay for better education for their children. So the agricultural revolution and cottage industry were working hand in hand and creating a cycle that produced several things. Number 1, lower food prices, because there's more food. Number 2, higher wages. Number 3, a bigger labor pool for manufacturing, because not everybody's farming anymore. Number 4, a bigger, more commercialized market for manufactured goods of all kinds. And these are manufactured goods that you have to pay for with cash. You don't need cash for the things that you make yourself, that you use for yourself on the farm. But those extra things that you have to go out and buy, you need cash for those. We also said that Britain had the right geography. There's lots of access to water in Britain. And water, as I'm sure you could guess, is much cheaper to move goods on than land is. It's a simple matter of friction. Britain is going through a canal building boom at this time to make water even more accessible. So water is especially great for moving heavy things like coal and iron. We said that Britain had a relatively peaceful government. Britain had a highly efficient tax system. Taxes funded large armies and navies, and these armies and navies were used to provide peace and security to British interests around the world. The British had highly aggressive import duties, and these protected British industries from competition. And the British had laws that protected private property. And you, the investor, were more willing to risk your property in an enterprise if you know that some king somewhere is not going to come along and just take it. So far we have, number 1, a growing market for manufactured goods. And number 2, the need to innovate to bring labor costs down. You have to be able to compete for that growing market with other countries who want to take it from you. Otherwise, there's no reason that China and India can't come into the market with their cheap labor costs and sweep your manufacturing base aside. We said that advancement was a case of have a problem, solve a problem, run into another problem. And so let's just kind of go through that sequence. We'll take that angle to look at some of the innovations that were coming out of Britain as time went on. So on the left side, we've got time and the innovation and the advantage. What problem did it confront, and what solution did it provide? And so we're beginning in the year 1760, and this innovation is something we're already familiar with, the putting out system. What was the advantage of the putting out system? Well, it was economical. But one of the problems with it that we've already seen was that there were not enough spinners to keep a weaver busy. Keep in mind that in cottage industry, the main industry is in textiles, spinning and weaving thread. John Kay had invented a machine way back in 1733 that he called the flying shuttle, and this had doubled the speed of the weavers. Well, the solution to this problem of not being able to keep up with these weavers who now have the flying shuttle is you need a faster spinning wheel. Here's a painting, actually, of John Kay, the inventor of the flying shuttle, being attacked in his home by angry textile workers. And he would have been about 30 years old at this time, and these textile workers were afraid that his flying shuttle would disrupt their ability to make a living. Not everyone likes change, and he was actually financially ruined by having to sue factory owners for stealing his invention. This is a spinning wheel right here. So, the innovation is some kind of a machine that spins faster. The advantage was that you could keep the weaver a little bit busier. But the problem was that these early spinning machines, they didn't spin wool very well. So what was the solution to that? Don't use wool. use cotton instead. And here's a picture of some cotton. Well, by 1760, the innovation was that you could bring cotton from India to England. Remember, even ancient India was one of the first societies, even the River Valley civilization of the Indus River was one of the first societies ever to export cotton. And so the advantage of cotton was that these new machines could spin it better. But the problem is that these new machines still couldn't compete with the skills and labor costs in India. The solution that was going to be needed was a genuine breakthrough in spinning machines. Well, then innovation came in 1765 with an invention called the spinning jenny. Its inventor was James Hargreaves, and he was not a trained engineer. He was actually a carpenter by trade, and its power source was hand power. You had to hand crank it. And the advantages of the spinning jenny was it was simple, inexpensive, and it could spin fine cotton, not coarse cotton, but fine cotton. Problem was that as a hand-cranked machine, it was not very powerful. The solution to this was that you were going to find some way to provide more power. Well, soon came the water frame. The inventor of the water frame was Richard Arkwright. He was a barber by trade, not a trained engineer. Its power source was not hand power, but water power. So the advantages that the water frame had over the spinning jenny was that it was much more powerful. It could spin a lot more thread. But the problems with it was, number one, you couldn't use it at home because you needed it to be right next to a water source. And the other problem was that it could only spin coarse thread. It couldn't spin that fine thread that a spinning jenny could spin. So the solution was, number one, you put it near a water source where a lot of workers could work on it at the same time. And then the other solution was that once it was done spinning that coarse cotton as well as it could, you would then refine that thread at somebody's home on their spinning jenny. 1770s and 1780s. An innovation that you had was the watermill factory, a place where you could put a water frame where people could all work on it at the same time. It just wouldn't be workable in somebody's home. Its power source was water power. The advantages of this watermill factory was that you could get a lot of spinning done in one place because the workers come to you. But the problem with the watermill factory was that a lot of people didn't want to work in a factory. The solution was that you used orphans and small children to do the work. So this innovation was using kids in factories as, quote, apprentices. You're still using water power. And the advantages of using children in these factories was that you could pay them little to nothing. The orphanages saved money because they didn't have to take care of the kids while they're working. But the problem was that kids were exploited and abused on a truly unprecedented scale. Keep in mind, and I'm going to say this over and over and over as the Industrial Revolution progresses, none of this had ever happened before. The Industrial Revolution was absolutely new. And so the things that people are going to try to address these problems that come up, they're also brand new solutions. Well, the solution to the exploitation of kids and the abuse of kids in the factory was to outlaw using small children in the factories. And that took a while. This is a really interesting picture. It really kind of shows what we're talking about here. You've got a factory foreman, a boss, and he's just hitting this kid who's apparently messing up in the spinning process. And the other kids, that's what's really interesting to see because they have got their heads down. They do not want to call any attention to themselves, do they? In 1780, you had another innovation, the spinning mule. Its inventor was Samuel Crompton, not a trained engineer, but a musician by trade. And its power was also water power. But the spinning mule was a definite improvement on the water frame because it combined the power of a water frame with the fine spinning capabilities of a spinning jenny. And the problem that this created was that the tables were turned now between the weavers and the spinners. Now the weavers actually had trouble keeping up with the spinners because the speed of spinning with this new invention had increased so much. Solution: you need some kind of a powered loom for increasing the speed of the weaving now. 1785, you had a new innovation to try to solve that problem, and that was the power loom. Its inventor was Edmund Cartwright, a clergyman, not a trained engineer. Its power source was at first water, then steam started being used around 1790. Its advantages was that it made the weaving faster. The problem was that it didn't work very well. And so the solution to the problem of the power loom was a long series of improvements, one after another. And here you've got the power loom. We also said that Britain had lots and lots of coal. Before 1760, Britain's small iron industry used wood to heat the iron. But the problem was that Britain started running low on wood. Solution was coal, and so they started mining deeper and deeper for more coal. Problem is that when you mine deeper and deeper for more coal, those coal mines tend to fill with water. The solution to that was to pump the water out. The problem with pumping the water out of these coal mines was power. Animal power was expensive and bothersome. And here's a picture of an animal-powered water pump pumping water out of a coal mine. So Thomas Savery in 1698 and Thomas Newcomen in 1705 both invented steam engines. And this is generations before the Industrial Revolution actually took off around 1780. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, hundreds of Newcomen steam engines were powering water pumps that pumped water out of coal mines all over Britain. The problem was that Newcomen engines were extremely inefficient. Now, let me try to explain this. The main part of the engine was a cylinder with a piston. And the way that the Newcomen steam engine worked was you'd fill the cylinder with cold water, you'd heat the cylinder. Heating the cylinder turned that cold water into steam, and that steam would expand, and the steam pushed the piston out of the cylinder, and that created steam power. But then you had to cool the cylinder down again, and that caused the steam to condense back into water, and then the cycle would begin all over again with you reheating that cylinder. And heating and cooling that cylinder over and over and over again was a huge waste of energy. And this waste meant that you used excessive amounts of fuel, and this excessive use of fuel meant that the Newcomen steam engine was expensive to run. Then came James Watt, who lived from 1736 to 1819. James Watt was an instrument maker. He was employed by the University of Glasgow, and in 1763 he was called in to repair a Newcomen steam engine. Now, this engine was not pumping water out of a coal mine. It was actually in a university classroom being used to teach university students about steam engines. So as we see, Watt was actually working in that institutionalized culture of innovation that we were talking about. And what we see here was the power of bringing technology into the classroom. Watt began to study this Newcomen steam engine, and he thought to himself this: what if you could suck the steam out of that cylinder, condense it back into liquid with a separate device, and then inject it back into the cylinder as liquid? That way, you could keep the cylinder hot, and it would save huge amounts of energy because you wouldn't have to constantly heat and cool the cylinder. And the machine would then operate with radically more speed and power. And in 1769, Watt patented the condenser. And here is a picture of Watt's condenser right here. It looks very simple. We also said that Britain had an advanced banking system. So we're going to identify that reason too as we continue the story of James Watt. It takes lots and lots of cash and investment to turn an idea like Watt's condenser into a reality. And in 1775, James Watt partnered with Matthew Boulton. Boulton was a wealthy industrialist and entrepreneur. He knew how to get his hands on capital, and he even paid Watt a salary to keep him able to work more on this new steam engine idea. And they formed a company together called Boulton and Watt. The eighth thing that we identified was that Britain had many skilled artisans. Watt's machine was a complex engine, and he needed all kinds of mechanical expertise to manufacture, install, regulate, and service this machine. And Watt actually got a cannon maker named John Wilkinson to produce his engines. Wilkinson invented a precision boring machine that could produce the iron cylinders that were necessary for Watt's engines. Without all of this financial and technical support, uniquely available in Britain, James Watt's steam engine could not have changed the world. And even then, it took 20 years of hard work from many people. James Watt eventually became super wealthy. Once you've created a steam engine that can do rotary motion, you could apply almost unlimited power to any activity you could imagine. Spinning cotton, grinding, anything, crushing sugarcane, bellowing a huge blast furnace, rolling finished iron into any shape. Iron, the building block of the economy. Before the Industrial Revolution, Britain was running out of wood, and you couldn't smelt iron with coal. Coal burns too smoky, it's too fumy. But you could refine the coal with heat into coke. Coke has the water and impurities burned out of it, and it burns really hot, and it doesn't smoke. Here's a picture of the Vale Royal Furnace. Well, in the 1780s, Henry Cort invented the puddling furnace. Puddlers were the people who worked on it, and it used the great heat produced by coke to refine pure iron cheaply. Henry Cort also invented rolling mills. You could roll that molten iron into any form you needed. Here's a picture of the insides of a puddling furnace. And here's the outside of a puddling furnace right here with the molten iron coming out of it. And here is a picture of a rolling mill, rolling molten iron into any shape you want. Another picture of a rolling mill. Another picture of a rolling mill. And still another picture of a really, really big rolling mill. Transportation. Next question is, you got your steam engine, it can create rotary motion, it's very powerful. What if you could put a steam engine on a vehicle? How fast and how powerful could that vehicle be? Before the Industrial Revolution, the coal industry was already using rails for transport. But after the Industrial Revolution, in 1816, a rail was finally developed that could actually support a steam engine. I mean, you had to have a rail that could support that kind of weight. The rocket locomotive made its appearance. George Stephenson, the father of railways, developed it in 1829, and it got up to 35 miles per hour. Fastest vehicle ever up to that point. And people started building rail like crazy on multiple continents. George Stephenson was not the first person in England to work on the idea of a locomotive. As James Watt's patent lapsed, many people were working on applying steam power to all kinds of needs. Richard Trevithick actually got a steam-driven locomotive to haul 10 tons, almost 10 miles, as early as 1804. George Stephenson was actually in competition with two other inventors who were working on the same thing he was working on. William Hedley and Timothy Hackworth had a locomotive called the Puffin Billy. But we recognize George Stephenson as the father of railways for two reasons. Number one, he actually designed not only locomotives, but also railways, including the first public railways. And number two, Stephenson's rocket beat out many other locomotives because of its numerous state-of-the-art inventions and superior overall design. The effects of the railroad, and what you're going to see here as we go down this list, is one thing leads to another. So here they are. Number one, overland freight became safer and cheaper. Because of that, number two, markets became bigger and even nationwide. Larger markets lead to bigger factories, more capacity because you got a larger market, you got to make more. Number four, the Industrial Revolution now spread because of the railroad to more industries. A greater variety of products became cheaper because of the railroad. Cottage industry workers and urban artisans suffered because of the railroad. 5. The railroad created a strong demand for more unskilled workers. And 6. This caused the growth of a new class of urban workers. Ships. In the 1770s, steam engines were first used on ships in France and North America. They made travel faster, more reliable, and more efficient. Finally, the Crystal Palace was built in Hyde Park in London. It was built in 1851 entirely out of iron and plate glass, two materials that had become much less expensive because of the Industrial Revolution. And in 1851, it hosted what was called the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, but you can just call it the Great Exhibition. It was a time to look back and celebrate all that had been accomplished in the last 70 years. 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace. Here's another picture of the inside of the Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace actually burned down in the year 1936. And here's a picture of the inside. The population boom. Britain had 9 million people in 1780. It had 21 million people in 1851. And this growth was necessary to industrial development. Population growth sustained the growth of industry. The growth of agriculture and industry sustained the growth of population. Population growth consumed much of that new material output. This population growth, however, cast a dark shadow over the industrial growth for decades because nobody was sure that this population growth wouldn't overtake industrial and agricultural growth. If it were to do that, you'd be looking at a massive human calamity. And it wasn't until about the 1840s, late in the Industrial Revolution, that it began to look like that was not going to happen. A man named Thomas Malthus studied the economics of population growth, and he came up with what was called the Malthusian growth model. And in this growth model, Thomas Malthus predicted that England's resources could not possibly sustain this population growth that was going on. When goods became scarce, the poorest people would suffer, and he maintained that there was only one solution to this population growth problem, and that was marry later in life. Marry later in life, then you have less time to have children. David Ricardo, who lived from 1772 to 1823, came up with what he called the iron law of wages. And what he said was this: because of population growth, wages would always tend to stay right at subsistence level. And Ricardo called this an iron law because it happened so often in the past without fail. So why did these two guys, Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, turn out to be so wrong? Well, keep in mind that in any other context, they would have been completely right. But two things. Number one, nobody had ever seen anything like the Industrial Revolution. And number two, productivity rose way beyond what anyone in their time could have imagined.